Hello everyone, my name is Anna LUNGARSKA. I am a postdoc student at the CLAND and the AgroParisTech. I have a PhD in economics under the Oracle project with the supervision of Pierre Langeillet, who's working at UMR Economie Publique at INRAE. And I've done some postdoc work also at the same institute on the Trusty project and later on the STIMUL project. And now, since August 2020, I've integrated the CLAND project and I'm really happy about it. So let me tell you more about my studies. My PhD thesis was focused on the special heterogeneous nitrogen fertilizer, and we've looked at some paradoxical effects related to crop switching when we aim at reducing the nitrogen fertilizer through taxation. Later on, I've worked on the impact of climate change on land use in France. We first, with my colleague Raja Shakir, used a special econometric land use model to relating the sector-specific economic models for agriculture and forest, which allowed us to forecast what will be the future land use in France. Later on, we've used our methodology in another study where we looked at what are the impacts of the climate-induced land use change when agriculture adapts and also mitigates its greenhouse gas emissions. During the Trusty project, I've studied the direct and indirect through land use change effects of climate change on freshwater fish populations in France. And the STIMUL project was focused on the impacts of a halving nitrogen fertilizer policy in the European Union's agriculture in terms of yield, production, crop allocation, land use. So in order to conduct this study, we've used some crop models, economic models, and so on. I will later on talk more about this project since it's part of the CLAND initiative. Also, we've looked on the carbon sequestration resulting from the changes induced by the policy, and we looked on biodiversity. Okay, what tools do I use? I work with the simulations from mathematical programming models, and I do some econometrics, especially spatial econometrics, and a lot of GIS manipulations. Okay, so my role in CLAND is conducted in the Challenge 3, which is managing the transition towards an integrated land management. And my research is in line with Researcher Line 3.2, which is policy options for transitioning to sustainable land use futures. And inside this research line, my work is conducted in the working project Working Package 1, Policy Options for Mitigation and Ecosystem Services Provision in Land-Based Sectors and their articulation with adaptation strategies, and also the Working Package 2, Water, Food, Energy, Biodiversity Nexus, coordinating different policy objectives. So, in line with the Working Package 1, we are conducting an assessment on the impacts on ecosystem services when agriculture mitigates and adapts to climate change. This study combines the work on the link between different ecosystem services and land use, conducted by Raja Shakir and Issam Ali Mouandier, and also the work on climate-induced land use change that we've done with Pierre Langeillet and Raja Shakir. Our study focuses on 2 climate change scenarios and looks at the mitigation policy, which is a tax on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And we look at the direct and indirect, where indirect is through land use change, consequences of climate change. The ecosystem services we focus are 6 regulating services, which are habitat quality index, water retention index, organic matter in topsoil concentration, carbon storage, NOx deposition velocity, soil erosion control. We compare the evolution of these 6 regulating ecosystem services to 2 provisioning ecosystem services, which are crop production and livestock breeding. So, French agriculture is supposed to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 12% before 2030, and by in line with the emissions from 2013, and by 50% by 2050. So, one way to attain this objective is to introduce a greenhouse tax, and we simulate different levels for this tax, going from 0 to 200 tons per CO2 equivalent. And we know in economics that such taxation of greenhouse gases is what we call a first best policy, and it provides us with an optimistic estimate of the abatement costs behind the policy. We realize that a taxation of greenhouse gas emissions is hardly acceptable by small farmers, but some of these farms can be exempted without welfare loss because of monitoring costs and the unequal distribution of emissions. So here are some of the results. We used the land use scenarios obtained in our previous paper. We have the A2 and B1 scenarios, and here we look at 5 types of land use, which are forest, urban, other, crops, and pastures. We can see that our estimates say that under the climate change scenario, we're going to experience a loss in the forest area, which is benefiting crops and pastures, and to some extent the urban and other uses. The difference in the evolution of the urban surface between these 2 scenarios are related to the demographic assumptions behind the 2 IPCC scenarios A2 and B1. We can see also that when we introduce the greenhouse tax in terms of euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, here are given the levels going from 0 to 20 to 50 and 100 euros per ton. We can see that we can reduce the loss of forest area and as well the loss in pastures, which are related to the climate change scenarios. And you can see it here in the control case that introducing the taxation, it's clearly increasing the forest area. Okay, so once we have these land use scenarios, we can plug them into the models we've developed for the ecosystem services. And here are the general results that we obtain. Here are presented 2 ecosystem services, which are the habitat quality index, which is like our way of measuring biodiversity. It is like a way to measure biodiversity. And we also have the carbon storage in the topsoil presented. We have greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector and also the calories produced. We have the profit of farmers and the livestock production. So livestock and kilocalories. These are the two provisioning ecosystem services I mentioned before. We can see in the control case that introducing a strong greenhouse tax of 200 euros per ton will have a net impact in terms in greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but it also reduces greatly farmers' profits along with their production in livestock and crops. The reduction in these ecosystem services, along with the land use change that are associated with it, are linked to an improvement in the carbon storage, because, as I mentioned before, we have more forest and more pastures, and a better, but to a limited extent, HQI index. Here, climate change, our results show that it can be beneficial for carbon storage and habitat quality index. So we have a greater effect here in the two panels for the A2 and B1 scenario. We have less impact of the policy in terms of profit loss and also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We see that we are still losing in terms of livestock production, but we're either neutral in the A2 case in terms of crop production, or we're still having some increase in it. So there is some trade-off between, especially between the profit of farmers and the provisioning of the regulating ecosystem services, and there the introduction of the tax is limiting strongly the improvement in the crop production and in the livestock breeding associated with the climate change scenarios, and profiting on the regulating services. So this is my work on the work package 1, and on work package 2 my tasks include the finalizing of the STIMUL project, where we study the halving of mineral nitrogen use in European agriculture and its impacts, and probably if the time allows it, conduct a study on the impact on water quality of this policy, and compare the results to the results obtained for greenhouse gas emissions. So more about this work. In the STIMUL project, we are many partners. And it is a pluridisciplinary project where we have people on the climate side and also agronomists and economists and specialists in biodiversity. So I will focus on what I know the best. So this is the economic part. And this is the first paper that is in production from this project. So, what does it mean to have? What does it mean to have the use of mineral nitrogen in European agriculture? We can see that it will have a strong impact in terms of land use, as predicted by the AgroParisTech supply side model. And we see that we have a loss in the cropland, here in green, and an increase, a small increase in pastures. So these are relative changes in percents. They don't sum at one, so don't be bothered by this. And for the NLU model, which is a partial equilibrium model, we have an increase in cropland and a decrease in pastures. And also NLU, because of it's a global scale model, it also predicts the effects outside the European Union, in the rest of the world. And we can see that in the rest of the world there is also an increase in cropland and a decrease in pastures. Okay, so a bit more on AgroParis and NLU models. AgroParis is a supply-side model of the European agriculture. It means supply-side means that we don't model the whole food market. We only have European production, so we model farms at the scale of groups of farms, and for each group of farms we have some production functions relating to inputs, which are water and nitrogen, and each farmer can allocate its land to different types of crop production or pastures, and this will depend on the profitability of different crops. So when we here we are taxing the nitrogen use, this leads to a reduction in its use. So our objective was to halve the use of mineral nitrogen, and we can see that it will have a really strong impact for AgroParis compared to Nexus land use. These models, they have a lot of differences in their functioning. So here NLU is a partial equilibrium model. It models the market. So we have a constant demand of food, meaning like we are 7 billion people on Earth. We all eat, saying that we all eat the same amount of food before and after the policy. And because of the reduction in European production, there is going to be an increase in the price of food, because our demand is inelastic in the model. And because of this price increase, farmers, they will substitute between their factors of production, which are here land and fertilizers, and they're going to put more land into crop production comparing to pastures, because the model only takes into account these two uses. The forest area is exogenous. So this is the price factor is one of the reasons why we have this divergence between the results of the two models. And then another important implication is that we see that European agriculture is going to suffer from its competitiveness is going to suffer from the new policy. So we're going to import more food, which is going to be produced elsewhere, and this is a potential source of leakages. And as we're going to see later in the presentation, there are more greenhouse gas emissions totally from at the global scale, resulting from our health and policy at the European level than before. Okay, so here are the other results of these simulations. We see that we're going to use less organic nitrogen, which is a bit awkward. It's like it's not what we would have expected as an effect, because mainly when we say we're going to reduce mineral nitrogen, okay, we're going to substitute it with organic nitrogen, but organic nitrogen needs to be produced. This means having animals, and in order for animals to produce manure, they have to eat before. So you have to feed the animals, and with an increase in crop products price, you know that it's going to be more expensive to feed the animals, and their demand is possibly going to be impacted. So we see that we're going to have less organic nitrogen. In AgroParis, this is also the result of the limitation of per hectare quantity of organic nitrogen that we can apply, meaning that you cannot apply more than 170 kilos of organic nitrogen per hectare of cropland. this is related to water quality issues, and we apply it to all of our farmers. So at one point, when we reduce the cropland area, as we saw before in the previous graph, you can spread your manure on less surface, so you potentially get blocked by the constraint on the quantity of organic N. So you will have to dump your manure elsewhere or valorize it otherwise. We see that there is a strong impact also in terms of crop production, and the yield per hectare is more strongly impacted in the Nexus land use model. Why is this so? This is mainly because of putting into production some land that is less fertile when we substitute land for fertilizer. And in AgroParis, our reduction is also associated with the fact that we are going to abandon some land. So we're going to focus our production on the most productive land. So even if we apply less nitrogen per hectare, we're going to have a better yield than on fertile land than on less fertile land. We see that there is a great increase in the yield for the rest of the world, and we also see here some greenhouse gas emissions. We have some increase in AgroParis because of the changes in the animals bred. There are the different types of animal bred in the model. In Nexus, we see that there is going to be a reduction because there are less livestock here. And we see that we're going to have more in other parts of the world because of the change in the export-import structure. And we see that there is going to be a strong impact in terms of nitrous oxide. But even though these bars are not giving this idea, in reality we're going to have more emissions on overall because the global emissions, they are much higher than these of Europe. Okay, so later, here we see on the left the change in the cropland area as predicted by AgroParis. We see that there are some strong heterogeneity between regions, with some that are more impacted and others that are even impacted in a positive way, while on overall we have a loss in cropland area. We can see here that we're going to have much land that is going to be abandoned or put in a fallow. So we're reducing the cereals area, we are reducing greatly the oil crops area. Which remains relatively stable are the leguminous crops and tuberous crops. We see also that there is an increase in pastures. You should know that these small variations at the European level are masking some major changes at national or regional level. Here are the results per hectare of mineral nitrogen use on arable land. We can see that mineral nitrogen use is going to decrease. And we can see also that organic nitrogen use per hectare is going to generally increase in most of the countries. And this is what I was telling you, that production is going to be focused on most fertile parcels, so that we combine the rare resource in terms of nitrogen with the land that is capable of producing the most yield. Here are the results of these simulations in terms of net ecosystem exchange calculated by Orchidea. We can see that when we have a negative net ecosystem exchange, we have a sink for carbon, and when we have a positive, it's going to be a source for carbon. We can see that with the reduction in cropland predicted by AgroParisTech, we will have more sinks, while the extension of cropland predicted by Nexus will result in more carbon emissions. So you can see here the global results. It is still a work in process. So these are not our final word on the matter. So on overall, what our simulations tell us, we see that in the European Union we will have lower yields, we will have a global agricultural production. Globally, at the European scale, agricultural production is going to be reduced. Most surprisingly, we have less organic nitrogen, and on this the two models agree. And we'll have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at the European level. We see that the land use change predicted for the two models will result in more carbon storage in AgroParisTech and less carbon storage for Nexus land use. And in terms of biodiversity, which is another indicator that we evaluated in this project, we'll have more biodiversity with the results from AgroParisTech, and more or less it depends on the indicator of biodiversity for Nexus land use. We saw that we're going to have some major spillover of our policy and the leakage in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the rest of the world because of the increase in nitrogen use in these parts of the world, and the increase in their yields and the increase in their agricultural production associated with an increasing food prices on global markets. And as I mentioned before, the increase on overall in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So why is this study important, and why shouldn't we be discouraged by the greenhouse emissions leakage that we see? In fact, nitrogen is resulting in three types of pollution. On one hand, we have the nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas emission. And on the other side, we have nitrates and ammonia pollution, which are local pollutants. Nitrates is particularly impacting water bodies. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions at the global level, maybe we'll be losing, but at the local level, we will improve the environmental quality for European citizens, and this is quite an advancement in people's life. So we should at one point measure the benefits and the costs of this policy, and not only focus on the impacts in terms of yields and so on. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. Here are some resources and references on articles I've worked on if you want to go further into my research. Thank you.